All right, we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Ulka Joshi Hansen. I'm co-interim executive director here at Grantmakers for Education. I'm also the chief program officer. On behalf of our team, I want to welcome you today and thank you for taking some time out to join us for today's webinar on intermediaries and philanthropy, seeding community work at the grassroots. So this is the second in a series of webinars that we are putting on in partnership with our equity and grant making group, impact group. So about 2 years ago, we started having a lot of conversations internally and with our members about equity and grant making, equitable grant making practice. Obviously, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning in America, I think a lot of our members were keen to learn more about it. And as we've delved into conversations with members as part of that impact group, a couple of themes started to emerge. And one of them was the ways in which kind of the dominant way of operating, both in terms of systems of education, but also in systems of philanthropy, the way that these dominant ways of doing things make it hard for us to live into the values of being proximate with communities, being in partnership with the folks that we are trying to serve, really being able to be responsive. And so the first of this series was about cultural conceptions of philanthropy. And we had 3 guests who came in from different kind of indigenous, Native, African-American, Black philanthropic backgrounds to speak with us about how different cultures and communities conceive of the idea of giving, of philanthropic practice, what it entails, what it means. And we wanted to follow that conversation up with a webinar focused specifically on intermediaries. It's a term that we're hearing being used more and more by members, but to dig in a little bit more into what intermediaries are, what roles they play, and why kind of working with them and supporting the work that they're doing is so important in any conversations that we're having about moving educational equity, racial justice, and sort of progress for communities that have been marginalized and not well served by our current system. So really happy today to have our 3 panelists. We have Felicia Lucky, who's president of the Black Belt Community Foundation, Kam Mua, who's the National Deputy Director of CIRAC, and Kiyomi Fujikawa, who's with the Third Wave Fund. So thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking time. I want to start with by asking each of you to just share a little bit about you, your personal why, and a little bit about the organization that you're representing today. And then we'll sort of move into deeper conversations about the exact nature of the work that we're doing. So Felicia, how about we start with you? Tell us a little bit about you, your story, and the Black Belt Community Foundation.
Hey, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to say thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to share the story of the Black Belt Community Foundation. A little bit about me. I'm a proud daughter of Alabama's Black Belt. I was born and raised in a small town called Livingston, and I vowed, like most folks who are from small towns, to move and never come back. And I found myself after a short stint in corporate America, because I decided early on that I wanted to do all of what I had seen my parents do, particularly my father, who was a community organizer from the time he was in college. And I decided that I wanted to be everything but that. My mother was an educator. I decided I wanted to be everything but that. And I said, I'm going to corporate America, make lots of money, and not try to save the world and people. And I did that, but there was this huge void and gap for me. And I found I was called back. And so I came back home to the place that I vowed not to come back to. And while I was here doing economic development work, because I knew that there was something completely wrong with my community not being able to grow and flourish as other communities were, I knew that to have 3 siblings, including myself, to at least 2 have terminal degrees and 2 have master's degrees, but not being able to find a place for employment in our own hometowns, that just never felt right to me. So I came back to do that work. While doing work around economic development, they were building this foundation, going around talking to people in communities, asking for volunteers to build a foundation, a community foundation that would serve the region that was not previously being served. I came to the table as a volunteer, and I just thought it was the absolutely coolest thing, because it wasn't building something for someone and saying, this is what you need. It was saying, what do you want? How do you want your communities to look? How can we help you do that? And that's what pulled me into the work. And I've never been able to leave since that time. And I know that I've been here since 2004, and that was the date that we were founded, a little around 2011. And since that time of coming to the table, I came with the very intention of being able to help secure resources for our region, because we were an area that was, we were very under-resourced at the time, but there were good and charitable works that were taking place. So it's important for me to come home to do that, because I had a void I needed to fill. That was the selfish part of me, but I also knew that there were others who deserved that as well. And I wanted to be a vehicle to be able to help that happen. And so I'm really excited that since that time, we built a foundation with and for community, and not being an endowed institution, we pushed out over $25 million into our communities to help sustain our growth. And that's remarkable for us, because our region is a little under 200,000 people for a 12 county region in the state of Alabama. So it really is an honor to be able to sit in this space to do this work. And we know that for us, the calling is even greater, because there's been a complete under or disinvestment in the Deep South in our country particularly. And when we look around and we see that the state of Alabama has had nearly $600 million in grant making, but only 2.74% of that benefiting people of color, a little under 16 million. And then there are some data from a report that was done by Grant Makers for Southern Progress that says that the Black Belt regions and the Delta regions, which are predominantly African-American communities, received only $41 in foundation funding per person between 2010 and 2014, compared to the national rate of $451 per person. And then looking at New York having $995 per person. So there's a complete disinvestment and underinvestment in the regions of the Deep South, particularly that are led by African Americans. And that's a space that our foundation has chosen to stand in. And we know that because we look different and we serve different, that oftentimes we're treated differently, but it is important to us to make sure our community's voices are heard. But you're muted, Olga. Yes.
Sorry, thank you so much. I just thank you for that. And I want to put a pin in a couple things that we want to come back to. So this idea of being a non-endowed foundation, and what you just said about because you look different, you're often not perceived the same way in sort of philanthropic and other spaces. So definitely want to come back. But for now, Kam, want to go to you and ask you the same questions, a little bit about you, your why, and CIRAC.
Yeah, thank you for that. My name is Kam. I am the National Deputy Director at CIRAC. And, I'm a Hmong American refugee. I was born in a Thai refugee camp, and my parents resettled in the US in '89. I started getting involved in this line of work, specifically through the lens of organizing refugee and queer communities. The very first campaign I ever helped run was a campaign to help protect an education program for Burmese and Bhutanese refugees to allow them to continue going to high school despite the fact that they've aged out of the process, because the school board was trying to cut the program, and which would result in all of them, losing their credits, having to get their GEDs instead. And so that's how I got involved in this work. And for me, it reminded me so much of the experiences that my family have also endured. One of the Burmese refugees, she said something during a community meeting that kind of sticks with me to this day. And, she said, my country took everything from me. They took my home, they took my family, and I come here to the US hoping to find a better place. And now I find that they're trying to take the same things away from me as well. Now they're trying to take away my education too. And, I think we still see that often in that sentiment within the Southeast Asian American refugee communities. At CIRAC, we were founded in 1979 as an organization to resettle Southeast Asian refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Nowadays, we're a national policy advocacy organization with an office based out of California, based out of Sacramento, and based out of DC. And while we are primarily a policy advocacy organization, we also do quite a bit of subgranting to our partners. In fact, we subgrant about 20% of our annual budget to state and local organizations, because we understand that our partners are not funded enough to do their work. Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander organizations are funded at less than 1% by the philanthropic community. And then smaller subgroups are funded at even smaller percentages, with many of them operating in informal capacities. When we convene our 80 or so partners to talk about the work that we do, the number one thing that they often ask us is, help us find money, help us fund our work, help us connect to funders, because at the end of the day, some of them, are trying to just have enough funding so that they can offer deportation defense services. Some of them are trying to keep the lights on. It ranges the gamut, but what we see constantly is that our partners aren't being funded for very necessary work, despite the fact that Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders are extremely diverse community that encompasses over 50 different ethnic groups and 100 different languages. Southeast Asians, our populations are not a monolith. I think we keep talking about that within the Asian American space, but it's because it's true. We have some of the highest income and educational attainment of all races in the US, but we also have some of the lowest, some of the folks who have the highest rates of poverty, lowest educational attainment rates, in the country. Recently Minnesota released some of their K-12 data, and Hmong and Southeast Asian students continue to have some of the lowest academic proficiency scores in math, reading, and science amongst all students in the state. So for us, we do this work because we realize that, very few of our partners are being funded. And even though we're not a huge organization and our budget isn't that big either, our goal is to make sure that our partners are being listened to, that they have some support to do their work, and that we can continue to make sure their narratives are reaching funders, and that their stories are that their leadership is also being able to sit in front of traditional philanthropy to talk about why our communities need to be funded.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Com. And just like I did with Felicia, I want to just kind of pull out a couple of things you talked about. Like, I'm really struck by you saying that the different organizations you work with are doing such different things. And so for you as an organization that is getting grant dollars from philanthropists, what is it when you can't necessarily say what it is that you're going to be doing because you're trying to be responsive? So want to make sure we come back to that. And Kiyomi, now to you. A little bit about you, your story, and about Third Wave Fund.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm very glad to be on this panel with all of y'all. Thank you so much. So my personal story, I grew up in youth activism, mostly around and youth organizing, mostly around looking at, anti-rape, anti-gender-based violence, anti-domestic violence work, and really doing that quite a lot in Asian Pacific Islander communities with LGBTQ folks, a lot of folks who, knew violence from systems as much as they knew interpersonal violence. And so when they were navigating interpersonal violence, a lot of the solutions they were looking for didn't involve policing, didn't involve even going to nonprofits really, or going into some of the so-called caring systems that we have set up, because they understood those to be sites of violence or just sites where there were a lot of barriers. And so really my lens to coming into this was really like understanding the links between state-based violence and also interpersonal violence that folks might be facing, and understanding that like the solutions were mostly coming from community. Folks were finding ways to keep themselves safe. They weren't always perfect, but there were different things that they were really trying to do. And so that was sort of the organizing work that I was coming from, and really just felt a strong affinity to youth organizing in terms of just like the intersectionality that it brought to just a lot of the issues that that my communities were facing. Fast forward a little bit, just in terms of my funding story, I was tapped to be one of the folks on the participatory grant making project for the Trans Justice Funding Project. So I'm also a product of participatory grant making, of intermediary funding. as a whole in terms of my ability to be here. And prior to working at Third Wave, I actually had an opportunity to work with Borealis Philanthropy with their Fund for Transgenerations. I worked there for about 2 years, and that's really where I even figured out like what an intermediary was, how they were different. I feel like philanthropy itself is kind of confusing by design. So just really, understanding what it meant to be raising the funds that folks were distributing and things like that. At Third Wave, sometimes we call ourselves an intermediary. I think factually we are an intermediary, but some of the words that resonate more with our staff and our grantees is thinking of us as an activist funder, a part of the communities that we're serving. We resource youth-led gender justice work that is mostly supporting, it's a buy-in-for fund that's supporting BIPOC young women and queer and trans and gender nonconforming folks of color around gender justice broadly. So really seeing the importance of de-siloed funding, but tangibly what that ends up being is like a lot of money for reproductive justice work, for LGBTQ work, also looking at things like the gender lens to a school to prison pipeline, or looking at immigration systems and just making sure that there's a feminist lens to that. Third Wave, I've been with Third Wave for about 5 years, but we just celebrated our 25th anniversary. We were actually founded by Rebecca Walker and some early Third Wave feminists and Third Wave feminist movements who realized just the need to fund all of the creative work that was out there. So I can pass it back to you there.
Great. Thank you, Kiyomi. And there are 2 directions I want to go, but because you set me up so beautifully for it, I want to go to this term intermediary, right? Because I assume there are folks on this call who've heard the term, but I myself, as you said, it's designed to be kind of complicated and I'm not sure I fully get it. So I'd love to ask each of you sort of what is an intermediary, especially in the way that your organization does the work, and why is it important to fund them, right? When might folks on this call who are funders want to be thinking about funding an intermediary versus other organizations directly? Oh, why don't we start with you, Kiyomi, since you started to go down the path. Yeah.
I'd be happy to kick us off. So I think that intermediary does cover like a lot of different types of organizations, but a common theme that I see reflected here are like buy-in-for organizations that really are coming from movements and communities that we're serving. I know for us, we think of ourselves as a pipeline, and I heard other folks name like being a pipeline to funding smaller grassroots groups that philanthropy either won't fund, can't take the risk on, or just like the number of grants that private philanthropy might be managing. It's like they can't be making those grants to groups that have never gotten a grant before, that the grant is going to be under 20K or just a very small grant. And so we tend to be a mechanism, just like we're part of a funding ecosystem and infrastructure that can get money to those places that a lot of larger funders can't. I think one thing that I really think of too with intermediaries is there's an opportunity, I think philanthropy as a whole has a power dynamic problem, right? Like folks with wealth are the folks that are usually making the decisions, or usually guiding the strategies. And we know that we actually need community-led resources and community-controlled funds. So I do think there is an opportunity in investing in community-led intermediaries that does lead us more towards how are resources more democratically controlled. A lot of folks have participatory grant-making processes or grant-making processes that are led by folks in community. So I think there's also a piece that's like larger vision of philanthropy and how there could be a transfer of wealth, a transfer of power from larger institutions towards community-controlled resources. And I think a lot of times we're piloting that, and a lot of times we're learning along our ways how we can use that, and also other folks can use those lessons. I think there's always a question of like, should I fund directly? Should I fund through an intermediary? And I think we need both, quite honestly. And I will say that like our grantees have told us that like, a grant from Third Wave is different than a grant from one of the bigger reproductive health, grant-making institutions. And that's not to say they're necessarily doing it wrong or there's problems with them, but there's just something different in terms of the values alignment, the transparency that they feel like they can offer us, because, you know, we understand their work on a lived experience level. And the last thing that I'll just say in terms of things you could think about for intermediaries is that we can be a strategy too if you want to move your board, your executive staff. If there's some way that you're like, this is the work I really want to be funding, and I know I'm going to get the block from, you know, from upstairs. Actually, sometimes funding intermediaries can be a little bit more palatable and a way to be like, we're going to learn from this intermediary why they're funding XYZ. So just, y'all are funder organizers on this call, you know, like y'all are trying to move your organizations towards racial justice. And so I think, please think of us as a way to move that strategy along too.
Thanks, Kiyomi. Felicia, how about you? What is an intermediary in the way that Black Belt Community Foundation does the work, and why would people want to be thinking about funding through you versus more directly?
Sure, and I'd like to say that Kiyomi covered a lot of the things I think are very relevant even with us in our work. And one of the things that she spoke that came to my mind is that if philanthropy is really about the love of humankind, and a way of loving all of humankind and not some of it, funding intermediaries is a way, or it's the vehicle that allows us to reach many who would not ordinarily be reached. So I think oftentimes in how the foundation does its work is, and I'll give an example of a partnership we had with the Council on the Arts. It's a statewide arts entity for the state of Alabama. They acknowledged that even though they were a statewide entity, they were not able to serve many of the smaller counties that had non-formal established nonprofits. And they said, we'll form a partnership with you to make sure those areas can get served. So that was a great opportunity, because if not, what the message sends is that even though we're a state agency, and they're a true partner of ours, so I say this all in the spirit of love, but is that if we're representing the state and we have portions of the state that does not have access to a state-funded program, then we're not doing our service. So for us, it really is, I think the whole intermediary concept gives funders an opportunity to truly serve and to love all mankind across the board, and not just some, not ones that look a specific way, but it really allows us to do it across the board. We are very similar in making sure that we were really created from day one. Again, we were not created with an established endowment. We were always created with the intentionality of bringing resources into this area that had not seen resources before. Even though people were doing their work, they were pulling and paying money out of their pockets. Many of the folks in areas that we've served did not know much about organized philanthropy. So it was a way to come in, and they felt completely validated by us being able to support them in their work. And so oftentimes, I think some of the stories that I hold on to the most is that it really is being able to share those assets that belong to everyone. And that's, you know, and I say to folks all the time, I don't think it's rocket science, and I probably say this webinar that I'm on, but if you're driving down the road and there's an obstacle, either you drive around it or you get out and move it, but very seldom do you just stop and you don't go anywhere at all. So if we don't know or understand, there's so many of us willing to come to the table, share different models, but as we are receptive to how funders work, we're asking them to also be receptive to how we work. And I think the greatest gift that intermediaries bring is they don't do it from the Rose Towers. You know, their elbows are rolled up, their sleeves are rolled up, you know, their hands are dirty, because they're working deeply in community. They're entrenched. And when they speak pretty much with, I know that's how I feel. I speak with my community behind me. So it's not Felicia speaking as an organization, but it's Felicia speaking with 184,000 people pushing me ahead to take care of this message for us. And because of that, that allows us to then reach further and dig deeper.
Thanks, Felicia. So I want to before I give the same question to you, just want to name Julie, we see your hand raised. So this is a webinar format. I'm excited you have a question and would invite folks that do have questions to please drop them in the chat. I have a couple more questions that I wanted to pose to our panelists and want to make sure that we're taking this conversation in a direction that works for your question, your interests. So same thing, intermediary. What does that look like for CIRAC? Why why have funders found it valuable to invest through you as opposed to other ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think Felicia and Kiyomi covered a lot of it. But for us at CREC, we never intended to, or at least I don't think we ever intended to be an intermediate organization. If for us, I think it came about out of necessity because so many of our partners were asking for funding or were looking towards us to help them seek out new funding streams. And many of them didn't have the relationships or didn't feel comfortable enough to talk with traditional funders. For us, being an intermediary allows us to fund informal organizations and new ideas that don't traditionally get a lot of money, quite honestly. It allows us to fund, small shops that are maybe, 10 individuals that are pulling together to, work on behalf of students or who are working to, end removals in a certain area of like Washington State. And oftentimes they're doing this in silos. And so the other part of being an intermediary is that it allows us to connect multiple groups across different regions and states to share best practices and to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheels so that we can make sure that the dollars that funders give us, impact more people and, reach more individuals in more regions. I think the other thing that, we've been able to do as an intermediary is streamline the funding process for a lot of our partners. I mean, a lot of them don't have the administrative infrastructure to do like a 10-page report on how the funding has helped them. And as a intermediate organization, we have essentially eliminated the need for reporting from many of our partners because our team can generate much of that information for them, saving them that back-end burden. So I think that's how we do our intermediary work. A lot of it is really about just making sure that we are able to fund organizations that don't traditionally receive money or who generally are left out of the conversation altogether. I think a lot of our communities generally aren't even part of the priority set for a lot of traditional funders. And so part of our role is to make sure that specific ethnic groups or identities are being included in the conversation or at least acknowledged, right? And then being able to use their funds to target some of those communities and help provide support where we can.
Uncle, you're muted.
I keep doing that because I'm trying to be nice. There's like noise outside my window, so I don't want to interrupt you. Thank you for continuing to remind me. So I want to move to kind of some bigger picture questions that I'm hoping you all will just kind of hop in and answer so that this can feel a little bit more like a conversation. And this is related a little bit to a question that I'm seeing in the chat about, are intermediaries always positioned as a pass-through entity, or are there instances where they would stand in as a lead organization on a grant while working with the smaller organizations they're connected with? So I want to put that question in the space for you all, but sort of pull back a little bit and say, we often hear reference to conventional philanthropy or how traditional philanthropy works. And I'm curious if you can define how you think about conventional philanthropy or the way that a lot of philanthropic institutions that might be on this call work, and identify some practices that they may have that are at odds with the kind of work that you are doing or the kind of organizations that you want. So just as an example, a number of you talked about informal organizations. So folks that might not have 501c3 status. And in most philanthropic institutions, you can't give a grant to an individual or whatever. So that's an example. What are other ones that come to mind for you that have come up in your work around how conventional philanthropy is just not designed in a way that allows it to do something important?
I can start. I think for me, when I think about traditional philanthropy, I think of institutions that don't generally fund Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander organizations, or really BIPOC organizations. I think because our communities have traditionally seen such a low amount of funding through the philanthropic process, for us, breaking through traditional philanthropy is partially also just getting philanthropy to notice and care about Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. I'll say that we saw an infusion of funds for our communities because of anti-Asian hate. But we know that it's not going to last. And I think in many of the conversations we've had with funders, point blank, a lot of them don't have a long-term commitment to engaging with that issue or using that issue as a way to engage with our communities in a longer-term process. And I think for us, pushing back against traditional philanthropy is, trying to make sure that philanthropy can engage with our communities for a longer duration of time and really invest in our communities. I think the other thing that, we think of when we think of trying to break past, traditional philanthropy is pushing for gen ops funding. I think, we've been very lucky at CRAC that, some of our biggest funders have transitioned from project-based funding to general operating funds, which has allowed us to be flexible and responsive to the needs of our partners because they have such different ways in which they're trying to, engage with some of these issues that funders care about that may not completely align with their, strategic priorities. And so it's a way for us to make sure that organizations that may not be, traditionally aligned with philanthropy, with the funder, but, has outcomes that are related to what the funder wants to do, that they can also be funded and engage in some innovative work on some of these topics. So I think, that's sort of how we do it. And to the question that was posed, it's not always a pass-through process. I mean, for us, we, have started, writing proposals in partnership with some of our, partners. There was a recent, proposal that we put together for our partners where we did the bulk of the work, we submitted it, we secured the funds, and we gave pretty much all of it to that partner. I think, part of our role isn't just to subgrant funds out to other organizations, but it's also to figure out how we can prospect together and work together and make sure that our communities are able to speak directly to some of these traditional institutions.
Is it okay? I like to add, and I appreciate that comment because as you spoke, there were several things that went across my mind when I thought about conventional philanthropy. And I think about the Black Belt Community Foundation. While we were initially started without an endowment, without the privilege of a lot of donor advised funds, we may have two, they have about 4 or 5 scholarship funds, but we look very different in as much as saying that we serve 12 counties. We directly implement 18 community programs out of our office. We have a central office staff of 11 that we work specifically around the foundation, but then we actually operate 6 Head Start centers in 4 of our counties, serving 307 children and families. We have another program that's our Head Start staff has around 71 employees. We have another program that's Black Belt Hope, that is a community health worker program that employs another 31 folks. We have volunteers who contribute nearly $500,000 in free service a year to help us do our work. We have a cadre of nearly 100 community volunteers who work hand in hand with us in fundraising, determining where our grants go, making grant awards themselves to respond to their community needs. So when I think about conventional philanthropy, it doesn't look much like what the foundation looks like, because I don't know of many other community foundations that operate a Head Start program or provide these direct programs into their communities. And so that's being said is that oftentimes whether we're the lead on a project or if we're working hand in hand with one, and I'll weave this in a storm in January of 2023, Selma was impacted by tornadoes that just devastated our communities. And maybe a couple of months before, we had launched a storm shelter initiative because in Alabama, not a lot of basements, and it's very rural and sparsely populated. So making sure our communities were covered. So we were the lead entity that brought in dollars and resources to help put into the communities, all of it into communities to help secure these shelters. So all of that looks very differently because we didn't have a donor advised fund to do this. So we have to find non-traditional ways and means of being able to meet our community's needs. And so oftentimes the message that I think is that it is extremely critical for our organization to be as strong as possible so that we can support, because we find ourselves not just standing in the space where conventional philanthropy stands, but we oftentimes have to occupy a much larger territory. And if we falter or fail, then that could mean life or death for our communities. So one reason I'll say in encouraging others to fund intermediaries who are what I call intermediaries on steroids, because I'm sure that all three of us aren't just serving an intermediary position, because it's not just about the financial resources, but also being able to connect, your communities so that you build and strengthen their capacity so that they're stronger, so that you're not doing the work alone. So I just know that there's a lot of opportunity in how, when we think about conventional philanthropy, I just think that it doesn't look like me, but I think there's a lot in what we do that can be learned to really shape conventional philanthropy so that it truly serves all mankind.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I feel like you really covered the pieces that I was thinking of too. I wanted to piggyback on the piece around sometimes there's these moments where communities are sort of flooded and, where it's like, oh my gosh, this anti-Asian hate crime happened, so let's put all this money towards it. There was a shooting at the Pulse nightclub, so let's put a bunch of money towards Florida LGBTQ work. And a lot of times that it usually ends up like the program that has the best social media presence or happens to be the one that like funders from outside the area might know gets like all of the, if you think of like a flower pot, all of the water and compost all poured into them. And there's a whole ecosystem around them that is not actually being supported. And I do think that intermediaries are very powerful in that case of breaking down some of like, when conventional philanthropy funds that way, it actually creates power dynamics within communities that weren't there before. And suddenly folks that are used to working together as partners are like, well, wait a minute, you have $1 million to show up to this meeting and I have 0. And I've seen actually a lot of organizations in those moments that are not planning to become intermediaries end up doing that role because they're like, we actually need to redistribute this out to our community. There's actually an overwatering of our pot, and across the ecosystem, we know that we don't function as well without, our partners. And so I think about that also in terms of sort of being that, I've lost the metaphor of what the like hose is that sprays out across, and is able to water more broadly. And I don't think that that's necessarily a malintent on conventional philanthropy's part. I think it's just they don't always know where the resources should go. And sometimes it's coming more from like a charity model than a model of solidarity or really understanding the community needs. So yeah.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, Com, I sort of like froze. I froze, or you froze, or I froze. I don't know what. So I may have missed a little bit in there, but I'm sure it was brilliant. But I'm hearing a couple of themes in what I've heard, right? That in some ways, in a lot of the way philanthropy operates, the theory of change is developed, right? According to a foundation with its vision, its mission, and it's not necessarily about what the community needs. And so what it sees is kind of driven by its own vision mission. I'm curious, none of you mentioned kind of theories of change and, how often they change and sort of what does that mean in terms of the ability of organizations like yours to kind of stay with community over a longer period of time. Another thing I heard, and Felicia, you said this, like the money is ours. And in the webinar we had on different worldviews and philanthropy, this came up a lot, that actually, the resources are there. There's this idea of abundance, like what we have, we give to the community, and we know that there will be more, as opposed to it's about keeping an endowment or sort of holding back dollars. So just a couple of things that, and then obviously sort of co-creation with your community in terms of what's needed. So we have a question which goes to where I wanted to go around impact. Like the way, how do funders need to be thinking differently about impact or measuring impact when it comes to intermediaries? And the question that someone asked in the Q&A was, what has been the most difficult conversation you've had to have with funders on convincing them why your organization is deserving of funding? And I imagine part of what might be challenging is being able to come up with like the numbers or whatever it is that feels like you're worth worth it or have an ROI. So just throw that kind of constellation of topics out to you.
Well, I know for us, being in a rural area, if it's numbers or if it's taking something to scale, we will always lose. Like we will never win there because we don't have those numbers. So oftentimes for us, we really have to focus on the impact that we're having in a region. And I'm going to just share a brief story. When COVID first hit, our governor decided that when CARES Act funding came down, that she would make it accessible to our communities on a reimbursement basis. And if you were a county or municipality that had resources, then that was fine because you could purchase and then get reimbursed. But if you were from a poorer community that didn't have access, you then wouldn't be able to access those. Then your communities would not have access to be covered or at least better protected or to help mitigate the spread of COVID. So that's not fair in anybody's book. I know where I live doesn't say that my life is important because my zip code says this and I can't access the funds because you put in a rule to be exclusive in the first place. So we couldn't change the rule, but what we could do as an intermediary and in our space was to galvanize funders to help us establish a guaranteed loan loss pool so we could offer revolving grants to our communities in the tunes of $50,000 a pop to go out and purchase what they need, then submit reimbursement to the state, and then bring it back, and then we re-grant it. I didn't have a team for that. We didn't necessarily have a model or a laid out theory of change, but it was what needed to happen at that moment to make sure our communities were protected. And Philanthropy answered the call from us, both near and far, to help us establish that loan loss pool. And you will not believe this, but we did not have one loan or grant that defaulted. Every dollar that went out was paid back. And so that shows you the nature of the people that we're working with. And so we've had to talk oftentimes about us being able to say, because now that fund might have been just a little over $1 million. So it wasn't an overwhelming amount of money, but the impact that it had over the 180,000 people that we serve was mind-boggling, because now you opened the doors and you made resources accessible to all. But it took a very unique strategy. And I oftentimes think, and I've heard people say this before, that if the civil rights era had to go through the funding doors, looking at the marches that were done, if they had to approach philanthropy, that it likely never would have been funded because it didn't fit the bill. And so it's not always what fits the bill that works, but it is really being able to answer and respond to actually have impact on community. As I talk with my team, I don't want to hear as much about the numbers. Now, I'm an accountant by trade, so don't get me wrong, numbers are important, but it is equally or even more so important to me to know the impact that we're making in our community, because that has to be the win for us, because our numbers will always be smaller. I don't have, $1 billion in endowment, or I don't have, $1 billion that I'm investing regularly. But I do have great numbers of people in comparison to the number of folks that we're serving. And that's the story that I have to share and really hound in with funders and helping them understanding that it's all relative.
Although, Felicia, I want to add, you said you have numbers, but the reality is in some communities, you might be serving 100 people because that's who's in that community. So in that sense, your numbers may not be big. So it's both, right? You have like numbers of people you serve, but like the objective numbers, right? Might not be as many as if you gave money to a city where all of a sudden there are 50,000 people that are served.
Yes. Because I'll say in one of the examples that we served, we had a city whose population was 183 people. And that was a town. And so, very small. So to your point, just saying that's very true. Thank you.
I think since Felicia talked about numbers, I can jump into this. For our communities, we don't often have data about them. One of the main things that we work on and talk about within the broader Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander diaspora and communities is the need to disaggregate data by racial and ethnic groups. And a lot of that is because when we aggregate data, we just don't know how our communities are doing, how we need to properly allocate resources. And the information that we generally get from state, local governments, federal government, from think tanks, from foundations. It's all aggregated data and generally, pretty useless for an organization like ours. It's hard to make the argument sometimes because we don't have the proper data to adequately argue the case. And in some instances, like funders in some communities don't view Asian American, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander students as minoritized students, right? Like they're not, like we've seen those in different spaces. I think the other major concern with, hard conversations that we have is trying to, as Felicia say, talk about how we scale our work. Southeast Asian American refugees make up a relatively small percentage of the larger Asian American community, but you can't just funnel all your money to the broad Pan-Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community organizations, because how are you expecting one organization to serve 50 plus different communities? So for us, it's always a conversation around how do we scale our work. And, oftentimes it feels like, continuously having to argue about the humanity and the needs of our communities, despite the lower population numbers, or the fact that the impact from a numerical perspective is generally a little bit lower. I think that also goes to how funders measure impact for intermediary organizations, because on our end, we recognize that there is no uniform way to measure impact and how we disperse funds. $20,000 to a organization that we work with in Seattle means something very different to one in Rhode Island, right? Our Seattle partners might choose to spend the $20K to hire a researcher, their only staff, and the organization in Rhode Island might use the $20,000 to engage in a campaign around the same topic that the researcher that the Washington State organization just hired someone for. It's hard for us to, to directly compare how these organizations are using their funds, because the needs are just so different, right? Other organizations are just trying to keep their doors open, and so for us, when we think about measuring impact, and how funders should be looking at it, I think funders should be thinking about, how do they rethink the phrase impact and what needs to actually be measured, and whether or not, organizations that have a smaller footprint can still align with the work of these foundations, even if scaling looks different.
Yeah. Thank you. And if I can tie something to what you said earlier, not only does a $20,000 grant mean something different to the two places, but you may not be able to say upfront what it is that those dollars would be used for. And so in that sense, like for somebody to ask you in an application, like, how are you going to use these dollars, right, is problematic, because you're going to be so vague that they'll be like, well, you have no idea what you're doing, or you're going to say something, but then not be able to meet the needs of the different communities that you're serving.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we see that the needs change consistently too.
Community impact, yeah, and conversations with funders about, I hate to say it, but like justifying, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think these are such rich questions. For me, I think a lot about how like we're funding grassroots movement building work. Like you can't write a one-year grant report. You can write a one-year grant report, but you're not going to see the same measurable impacts that you would see for the low-hanging fruits, the things that are easier to do. You're also not going to see the things that like folks took a risk on. Folks are like, we're going to try a thing, and it's really important for us to be flexible and experiment. And we might learn some things and be like, yeah, we will never do that again. That was not the approach to actually use. And I do feel like, conventional philanthropy does have a lot of groups stuck in this cycle of like, because you're reporting back and you're reporting back with your best face and a smile on, you're justifying programs that actually aren't working anymore. But you need to justify it because you need to keep getting funded. And there's actually like a cycle of inflexibility that is created because of the ways that folks sometimes focus on impact in a way that actually doesn't give room for folks to fail. And I will say, we give folks 6-year grants is our longest grant making. And I think the reason we do that is because we know for youth-led groups, probably, that's longer than an election cycle. That's longer than probably one youth leader will be there in terms of like stewarding the organization. There'll probably be a few leadership transitions through that. And what does it mean to fund with that amount of trust? Also knowing like we are raising our money mostly on 1 to 3 year grants. So we're also like making sure we're investing pretty hard when we're able to make those 6-year grants, but we know that that's what folks need on the ground. And we can look back and be like, okay, at the end of those 6 years, and we actually just released a report on like what were folks able to do with 6-year funding that they weren't able to do with, year by year funding. And look back and do that. But I do think, along the way, there are so many different turns that youth organizing can take that are like part of the process and are actually going to get us where we need to be. And that flexibility actually lets folks be more responsive and more visionary in their work than they're really able to be without that. And so I do want to make sure that like, we can do the impact measurements to know that groups are functioning, are groups, and like, how do we do that in a way that if folks are, slightly off the bell curve, it doesn't mean they're just immediately going to be cut. And then just really quickly to the difficult conversations. The other thing I just want to name is I think sometimes folks will confuse intermediaries and be like, well, seems like y'all are kind of holding the same place, in philanthropy. And they want like, kind of a silo for intermediaries too, and be like, okay, you are the, you're the intermediary that works on this issue, you work on that issue. And I do think that there actually is a lot of strength in having many intermediaries and knowing that we're part of an ecosystem together, and knowing that our groups on the ground, they actually have a stronger budget if they're funded by several groups versus just one intermediary. And so, and they have more flexibility and they're able to do more that way. So just understanding that we're part of an ecosystem, we're not actually in competition with each other. Our work supports each other's work. And yeah, I think that piece can be pretty difficult for us.
I love the fact that you use the term ecosystem, because in some of the conversations we've been having in this equity and grant making, right? If a lot of things in our dominant culture come from this kind of like efficiency, scalability, kind of more mechanistic kind of way of thinking, a different way of thinking about things is ecosystems, and ecosystems intentionally have redundancy and they have kind of multiple partners and pieces doing things, right? So it's just the metaphor of a living entity versus a sort of like, more factory or mechanistic model matters. So we're sort of into our last 5 minutes. I have 2 questions, and somebody has asked in the chat about how to find and connect with intermediary organizations in various geographic locations or across topics of interest. Is there an association or a place where you all come together to feed or support each other? So that's the question from the audience. And then I want to ask, and they're related. So what are ways in which funders that you work with have shifted how they operate that makes your work more possible? And related to that, all of you in some ways act as funders in some ways, right? You are giving money out to organizations that you work with. How do you handle and navigate those power dynamics? And I suspect there may be something about what funders do for you that you then do for others. So that's why I wanted to put those 2 questions together.
Let's see, I think oftentimes funders who've shown me that they trust our organization, they trust our work, they trust that change happens because we're there, is what I take when we're working with our organizations and as we're setting up our systems, that the demand to do work in a more traditional or conventional way, where every, long report needs to be created, or all of this needs to happen, that there is a strong level of trust because we are in relationship and in partnership in doing this work. And so when I have a funder who approaches me as a partner to affect change, then I see us working together for the good versus this just being a project. that happens and translates into our community and doing the work that the Black Belt changes because we're working in partnership with these other entities. So if the foundation, if BBCF is strong alone, that doesn't do much for the community, even though we see ourselves as the mother tree nurturing the BBCF forest. So we're strong and we're flourishing. We're able to nourish and make others strong, and that helps us. So it is really an opportunity for us to share power, share resource, empower, including resources, including decision-making, making sure that that doesn't just belong to us or that we don't own it alone, but that it is shared. And so I can say something as simple as when we decided to do the Head Start program or to operate it or administer it, this was not anything I had signed up for, but community approached us. Then we took it back out to other community members to say, if we do this, we're going to need your help. Are you willing to? And they said yes. And that means, excuse me, my throat is doing weird things. That means that we own this together and it's not just us. So that's been the greatest gift for us. I don't know the place where we all gather. I just know I usually see us if I'm at different conferences, there are us where there are different panels that may talk about this work, but I do see more funders having an interest in it. And I'm really grateful for that. I'm really grateful for the learning that has to take place. And I leave with this, that the more you're in a relationship or the deeper your relationship is with one, the more trusting you are of them. So to find a way, make time and space to learn and grow and become a true partner in the work, so that the work isn't just for the Black Belt region, but it is with the Black Belt region, and making change is what can be most helpful and I think most transformational for us.
Thank you.
I think what Felicia said really resonates with us as well. I think we often think of ourselves as an organization that is of and in community constantly. And, for us, it's making sure that we have honest, transparent, and meaningful conversations where we're able to have very difficult conversations that we wouldn't have with a funder, quite honestly. I think we've had a lot of growing pains with our partnerships into, as an intermediary, right? But, at the end of the day, it's about being able to have honest conversations with our partners when we don't have funds. Having honest conversations when we're telling them we're not funding them, even though we do have funds, because we're looking to build capacity for other people in the network, and having an understanding that we're in this work together and that we're trying to make sure that, we can maintain the life cycles of each of the organizations that we're working with, because for us, it's a long-term investment. I think the other thing that we've also done that helps deepen our relationship is that our work with our partners isn't just about funding either. Oftentimes it's about providing really deep technical assistance to our partners when they don't have any capacity to do it, be it in communications, in other areas of work, policy support, general staff support. I think, our goal is to make sure that our partners can always come to us, that they can yell at us, right, if they need to yell at us, and that, we can work through the difficulties together. And I don't think that's a relationship that is, something that partners generally have with traditional funders. And I think that's sort of what makes, the way that we subgrant a little bit different from how they engage with, their primary sources of income.
Thank you, Kam. And Kiyomi, we're sort of almost at time, but I definitely want to hear what you have to add as well.
Yeah, I would just say quickly on the finding intermediaries, places like Grantmakers for Education, Funders for LGBTQ issues, Funders for Reproductive Equity are all great places to start, depending on what the issue area or region is, also Grantmakers for Southern Progress. And to the power question, I mean, folks have just said the power of general operating support, of, not asking for too much information, not taking away from their work with the reporting, and also, to the points that have been already made around just transparency knowing why we're saying yes to folks, but also why we're saying no, which can be as powerful as a yes to some groups, because they actually understand other funder strategies and how they can leverage more resources in the future. So I know we're at time, so I can stop there, but thank you so much.
No, thank you. And I'm struck, right? Trust, transparency, relationship, long-term mutuality, like these are themes that all kept coming up over and over and over again in your answers. And the one other thing I might suggest around finding things, is it Sanji? But like often I find if I go to an organization that's doing good work and say, who's funding you, who's supporting you, then go to those organizations and say, who's funding you, who's supporting you? And you kind of call it snowball. But if you do that 3 or 4 or 5 times, I think you start to find often the kind of groups that are kind of consistently there, that have lots of different tentacles and or are sort of really deep in particular regions or spaces. So that's another strategy. Thank you all so very much for your time. For those of you who are watching, who want to go back or who joined us late, the recording of this episode will be available in about a week. And please do join us for some of our upcoming events. We've got a youth leadership, youth advocates for student affirming public education, and then a meetup where we're going to talk about this webinar as well as the last. You'll be able to find all of that information. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.